Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I still remember the exact moment I received the email, a message that felt like the opening of a door to a place I never imagined I'd enter. I'm a historian by training, specializing in ancient manuscripts and religious texts, and I had spent years working at various universities, barely scraping by with adjunct positions and short-term contracts. So when a well-known academic mentor forwarded me a confidential call for researchers at the Vatican archives, I could hardly believe it. The Holy See, the heart of centuries of Catholic history, was offering me a position as a visiting researcher. At first it seemed surreal, as if someone had made a mistake. Yet here I was, boarding a plane to Rome, heart pounding with a mix of excitement and something I would only later recognize as a deep, inexplicable unease. The archives themselves are not like any library I had ever encountered. When I first stepped into the vast halls beneath the Vatican, I was immediately struck by the weight of time pressing down on me. Endless rows of ancient shelves, towering stacks of dusty tomes, and fragile parchment scrolls lined every corner. The air smelled of old paper, wax seals, and something faintly metallic, like iron rusted long ago. The silence was overwhelming. Not a single stray sound, as if the entire place held its breath. I was shown to my modest research room, a small chamber lined with shelves and a wooden desk that looked as though it had been crafted centuries ago. Outside, the weather was gloomy. Heavy clouds rolled over the Roman skyline, casting the city in a muted gray light. It suited the mood, though I didn't know it then. My facile chassé. Ear's night, walking back through the labyrinthine corridors to my quarters, shadows seemed to twist oddly in the dim candlelight sconces. The echoes of my footsteps played tricks on my mind, sometimes seeming to lag behind, as if something unseen was walking just out of sight. But I dismissed it as fatigue and nerves. The other researchers and archivists I met were courteous but distant, their faces unreadable behind polite smiles. I was warned repeatedly to respect the strict rules of the archive: no photography, no removal of documents, and above all, no delving into the restricted sections. The exact reasons were never fully explained. It was understood that some knowledge was too dangerous. But what truly unsettled me was the way some staff lowered their voices when mentioning certain manuscripts, as though whispering could keep something at bay. As days passed, I began to immerse myself in the texts I was permitted to access, mostly mundane theological treatises and well-known church decrees. Yet even in these innocuous pages, I sensed a deeper current, a secret lurking beneath the surface. It was as if the very walls of the archives were watching, waiting for me to uncover what I wasn't meant to see. The second day at the archive started like any other, quiet, measured, and full of cautious anticipation. I had settled into a routine, poring over the manuscripts I was allowed to study, taking meticulous notes. But as I worked, I began to notice subtle irregularities that didn't add up. Some documents were mislabeled or misplaced, as if someone or something was deliberately obscuring certain pieces of information. It felt like a puzzle being deliberately scrambled, with layers of meaning hidden beneath the official records. That nagging feeling of being watched crept back again, heavier this time, tightening in the pit of my stomach. During one of my routine walks through the stacks, I caught sight of a door I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away in a shadowed alcove, plain and unmarked except for an old iron lock and a faded symbol I didn't recognize. I asked a passing archivist about it, but she gave me a brief, tense glance and said, "That's the restricted wing. No one is allowed in there." The way she said it wasn't just a warning, it was an unspoken threat. I nodded politely and backed away, but the door lingered in my mind like a wound that wouldn't heal. Later that afternoon, while sifting through a pile of documents, I heard something, barely audible, a faint rustling noise coming from somewhere deep within the archives. It wasn't the sound of the usual settling of old parchment or creaking wood. It was something else, like whispered voices or paper being moved deliberately in the dead silence. I stopped what I was doing and held my breath. The sound faded quickly, leaving me with a sudden cold realization. I wasn't alone. That night, as I sat alone in my small quarters reviewing my notes, the oppressive silence was broken by an unsettling creak from the hallway outside. The old building seemed to groan as if struggling to breathe, and the shadows cast. Yet by my solitary candle danced unnaturally on the walls. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the building settling, I told myself. Yet, deep down, I knew something was wrong. Unable to shake the feeling, I ventured out into the dim corridors for a moment, drawn by a mixture of fear and curiosity. The narrow hallway stretched out like a tunnel, lined with heavy wooden doors that seemed to watch me silently. The air was colder here, and the faint sound of whispers drifted from somewhere far ahead. My footsteps echoed softly, but every now and then I thought I heard a second set, slower, hesitant, almost hesitant to approach. As I reached a corner, the whispers stopped abruptly, swallowed by silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I couldn't tell if what I had heard was real or a trick of my exhausted mind, but the feeling of dread remained, crawling under my skin and whispering warnings I couldn't yet understand. By the time I returned to my quarters, my hands were trembling slightly, and a cold sweat coated my forehead. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious door and the voices. What was hidden behind that locked entrance? What secrets were the archives desperate to keep buried? And more frighteningly, was whatever was lurking beyond truly dangerous? I lay awake for hours that night, listening to the building sigh and creak around me, wondering if I had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The night after hearing those whispers, I felt like I was unraveling. My mind refused to quiet down, replaying every sound, every shadow that might have meant something more. Sitting alone in my cramped quarters, the thick silence pressing in, I realized the archives weren't just repositories of knowledge. They were alive, in some intangible, unsettling way. It wasn't just the weight of history bearing down. It felt like something watched, waiting for me to slip, to cross some invisible line. I tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, nerves, the stress of being in a foreign place, any excuse to explain away the growing anxiety. But logic didn't hold for long. The flicker of candlelight would stretch shadows into strange shapes. The slightest creak made me jump, and every draft felt like a cold breath on my neck. I found myself flinching at noises that, in daylight, would be easily dismissed. I kept questioning. Was I losing my mind? Was this all just my imagination? The more I tried to push the feelings away, the stronger they grew. I realized I was becoming paranoid, reluctant to leave my room after dark. Even the mundane tasks of research, which had once been a welcome distraction, now felt like steps deeper into an abyss I couldn't see. The archives were a maze, not just physically but mentally. Every time I thought I understood the place, something shifted, as if it didn't want me to make sense of it. I couldn't stop thinking about that locked door in the shadowed alcove, the restricted wing. I had been warned away, but the mystery gnawed at me. What secrets were so dangerous the Vatican barred even researchers like me from looking? I felt a strange kinship with the countless scholars who must have walked these halls before, driven by curiosity and faith, yet terrified by what they uncovered. I imagined the silence they endured, the pressure to stay silent, the dread that must have clawed at their minds in the dead of night. The archives seemed less a place of learning and more a tomb, a place where forbidden knowledge was entombed and protected. Emotionally, I was exhausted but also drawn deeper, as if the archives themselves had hooked into some primal part of me that craved answers, no matter the cost. I wrestled with the fear that by continuing my work I was inviting something dangerous into my life, and yet stopping felt like giving up on truth, on understanding what had been hidden in the shadows for centuries. That night I made a silent promise to myself, to proceed cautiously but without fear controlling me. Whatever lay behind the locked doors, whatever voices whispered in the darkness, I needed to face it. The line between courage and madness blurred, but I knew I was already crossing it. As dawn broke over Rome, faint golden light filtering through my small window, I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The archives had drawn me in, and I was only beginning to understand the price of curiosity. The morning light brought little comfort. I arrived at the archives feeling the lingering weight of the previous night's unease, but also a stubborn determination. My role here was clear, to study, document, and preserve the history housed within these ancient walls. But something beneath the surface whispered that the work would demand more than scholarly rigor. It required caution, patience, and perhaps a surrender to the unknown. The archives stretched out before me like a cathedral of knowledge, endless corridors of towering shelves, some so high I could barely see their tops even with the help of ladders. The air was cool and dry, carrying that familiar scent of old parchment and ink. I traced my fingers lightly over the spines of books bound in cracked leather, their gold embossing faded from centuries of handling. The hushed atmosphere was punctuated only by the soft rustle of pages turning and the distant echo of footsteps. Even the slightest noise seemed amplified in this cavernous space. I settled into a quiet corner near a cluster of manuscripts dated from the 15th century. The soft glow of an antique desk lamp illuminated my workspace, casting long shadows that flickered gently on the wooden walls. The weight of history felt tangible here. I could almost sense the hands that had penned these texts centuries ago, the lives intertwined with the faith and power they documented. Yet, as I sifted through the stacks, I began noticing oddities. Some documents were arranged in peculiar order, others appeared deliberately misfiled. References within texts hinted at events and figures not recognized in official records. My academic curiosity ignited. Something was being hidden, or at least obscured. Conversations with fellow researchers remained cautious, polite, but guarded. One archivist mentioned in a low voice that certain sections of the collection were off-limits for reasons that went beyond protocol. Another warned me not to trust everything I read here. The archives had layers of censorship, some dating back centuries. Their eyes flickered with unspoken fear, as if acknowledging a shared secret too heavy to voice. I spent hours tracing cross-references and annotations, piecing together fragments of a story that refused to fully reveal itself. The silence around me seemed to deepen as the day wore on, pressing in like a physical force. My thoughts raced between excitement and growing apprehension. What if the forbidden knowledge was not just a myth or exaggeration? What if it was real, and what consequences would uncovering it bring? As evening approached, the shadows lengthened, and the archives took on a different character. Colder, more impenetrable. I packed away my notes reluctantly, sensing that my research was edging closer to something dangerous. Walking through the labyrinthine corridors back to my quarters, I felt eyes upon me. Not human, perhaps, but something else watching, waiting. Outside, the skies darkened, rain beginning to patter softly against the ancient stone walls. I pulled my coat tighter, the chill seeping through my clothes. The Holy See was not just a place of faith and tradition, it was a fortress guarding secrets darker than any sermon I had ever heard. That evening, something shifted. The rain outside turned into a steady downpour, a rhythmic tapping against the stained glass windows that only made the silence inside feel heavier. I returned to the archives, despite the hour, drawn by an impulse I couldn't explain, a mix of obsession and dread pulling me back toward the books and the shadows between them. I was working late, alone in the dim glow of my desk lamp, surrounded by piles of manuscripts that whispered of forgotten histories and secrets better left undisturbed. The air had grown noticeably colder, the kind of chill that seeps through layers of clothing and settles into your bones. I pulled my sleeves down, trying to ignore the prickling sensation crawling up my neck. As I flipped through the pages of a particularly old volume, its leather cover cracked and brittle. I heard it again. That faint, almost imperceptible rustling, like the soft dragging of fabric or the slow, deliberate turning of a page somewhere far beyond my sight. I froze, my breath shallow. The archives had been silent all day, but now the noise was different, too purposeful to be a stray draft or settling book. My eyes darted to the dark aisles stretching beyond my small pool of light. The shadows seemed to press closer, thickening as if alive. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed movement. A flicker of something just out of focus, a silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm that drowned out the steady tick of the old clock on the wall. I forced myself to stand, every muscle tense, and slowly made my way down one of the long aisles. The smell of old paper grew stronger, mingling with something else, a faint metallic scent, like blood or rust. My footsteps echoed off the stone floors, but behind me I thought I heard softer, uneven steps, hesitant but following. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Turning a corner, I found myself before the unmarked door I'd been warned about, the one leading to the restricted wing. The iron lock glinted faintly in the lamplight, cold and forbidding. I pressed my hand to the door, its chill sending a shiver through me. For a moment I debated trying to open it, driven by desperate curiosity, but the memory of whispered warnings held me back. Whatever lay beyond was not meant for me. Suddenly, a whisper brushed past my ear, indistinct, like a breath or a word barely spoken. I spun around, but no one was there. The silence swallowed everything again, heavier than before. My chest tightened with a mix of fear and fascination. It was as if the archives themselves were alive, aware of my presence, warning me to leave. I retreated to my desk, hands trembling as I clutched the manuscript. But the room no longer felt safe. The shadows seemed to pulse and flicker, the walls closing in slowly. Every whisper, every creak was magnified in my mind. I realized I was no longer just a visitor in the archives. I was a trespasser in a place where the past refused to stay buried. That night, after I finally left the archives, the weight of what I experienced settled on me like a dark fog. The usual relief I felt stepping out into the cool night air was absent. Instead, an invisible tether seemed to pull me back toward that locked door, those whispered warnings, and the flicker of shadows that refused to be explained away. I wrestled with a mix of adrenaline, confusion, and a deep, gnawing fear that clawed at the edges of my reason. I sat alone in my small Spartan quarters, the silence around me suddenly too loud. Every creak of the building, every distant footstep echoed in my ears. I stared at the manuscript I'd been clutching earlier, the words blurring before my tired eyes. The ancient text felt less like a source of knowledge and more like a warning carved in fragile ink. What secrets were these pages guarding, and why did the very walls of the archive seem to breathe uneasily around them? I couldn't shake the sensation that I had crossed an unseen threshold, that by simply being present in that place after hours I had disturbed something old and restless. The line between scholarly curiosity and something far darker blurred sharply. My thoughts spiraled. Was I chasing history or something that should have remained buried? Had I awakened forces best left alone? Sleep eluded me. When I finally drifted into restless dozing, my dreams were invaded by fragmented images, shadowy figures lurking behind towering shelves, faint voices speaking in languages I couldn't understand, and that cold, unyielding door standing silent and watchful. Waking moments were no refuge either. The boundary between waking and dreaming felt porous, as if the archive's shadows had followed me into the world beyond their walls. Emotionally, I felt isolated. Despite the polite camaraderie of my colleagues, I knew these fears were mine alone. No one spoke openly of the strange occurrences, the whispers in the dark, or the warnings hushed in corners. The archive's secrets were guarded not just by locks and rules, but by a collective silence, a pact of denial that left me stranded in my fear and doubt. And yet beneath the terror was an undeniable pull, a need to understand, to uncover what lay beneath the surface. It was as if the archives had cast a spell, ensnaring me with threads of curiosity and dread intertwined. The knowledge here was not merely historical, it was alive, dangerous, and patient. That night I resolved to keep going, but with caution. I would tread carefully, listen harder, and watch closer. The archives had secrets, yes, but whether they were meant to enlighten or consume me, I did not yet know. Whatever awaited, beyond that door, I was no longer certain I could turn back. The days that followed were marked by a growing obsession with the forbidden. The locked door, the whispers, and the elusive shadows haunted my every thought. I told myself repeatedly that the archives were just a building filled with old books, that my mind was playing tricks. Yet, every time I walked past that unassuming alcove, the air seemed to thicken, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I decided to push harder in my permitted research, hoping to uncover clues that might explain the strange atmosphere. The Holy See's archives are enormous, a labyrinth of knowledge accumulated over centuries, carefully curated and protected. Each manuscript holds stories of faith, power, and sometimes fear. I focused on tracing references to unusual rites and censored heresies, anything that might hint at why some sections were off-limits. The other staff members remained distant but polite. A few exchanged brief glances when I brought up certain topics, their eyes shadowed with unease. One older archivist, who seemed to have worked here for decades, warned me gently, "Some knowledge is like fire, better left untouched." I nodded, understanding the warning, but my curiosity was a flame I couldn't extinguish. One afternoon, while sifting through a collection of medieval manuscripts, I stumbled upon an obscure reference to a secret wing of the archives, described in an old diary belonging to a long-deceased archivist. The diary was yellowed and fragile, its pages filled with cryptic annotations and warnings of a hidden chamber where the church kept records of things too terrible for daylight. The descriptions were vague but chilling, hints of dark rituals, unholy pacts, and entities not of this world. I felt a cold shiver run through me as I read. Could this be the very place behind the locked door? My academic mind told me to be cautious, to verify facts, before jumping to conclusions, but my instincts screamed that I was on the edge of something forbidden and vast. That evening, the air in the archives was thick with anticipation. The sky outside had turned leaden, heavy clouds blotting out the setting sun. As I made my way to my quarters, the corridor lights flickered briefly, plunging the hallway into an uneasy half-darkness. For a moment I stopped and listened. There it was again, a faint, almost inaudible murmur drifting from somewhere deep within the building. I realized then that the archives were not simply a place of silent study, but a living enigma, a web of history and secrets woven tightly together. Whatever awaited beyond that door was part of this tangled tapestry, a dark thread that I was both terrified and compelled to follow. The boundaries between scholar and seeker, between observer and participant, were blurring, and I was beginning to understand that in this place, knowledge was a dangerous currency, one that could change not only what I understood about history, but about reality itself. That night, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred in ways I hadn't anticipated. As the last light of day vanished behind the heavy clouds, I found myself drawn back to the archives, not by duty, but by an inexplicable pull I could neither explain nor resist. The building seemed alive with quiet murmurs and hidden movements, shadows flickering just beyond the reach of my vision. I was alone. The usual hum of fluorescent lights was absent, replaced by the faint glow of antique sconces lining the walls, casting long, wavering shadows. The air was colder than before, sharp enough to sting my skin even beneath my coat. I walked deliberately, each footstep echoing with unnatural clarity on the stone floors. My breath came in shallow bursts, misting faintly in the chill. As I passed familiar aisles, I noticed something I hadn't before. The books themselves seemed to lean and shift, as though stirred by an invisible hand. The faint rustle of pages turning whispered from deep within the stacks where no one else was supposed to be. A sudden draft carried a faint scent, something metallic, coppery, and unsettling. Drawn by a force I couldn't name, I reached the shadowed alcove where the locked door stood like a sentinel. Tonight the iron lock gleamed faintly, almost as if freshly polished. I pressed my hand against the cold wood, the texture rough under my fingertips. The whispers grew louder, indistinct syllables that teased the edge of comprehension but slipped away whenever I strained to listen. A sudden noise, a creak, a groan, echoed through the hallway behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw only empty corridors stretching into darkness. When I turned back, the lock on the door had shifted slightly, a hair's breadth, as if nudged by some unseen presence. I took a step back, breath catching in my throat. Then, a voice, soft, cold, and chillingly close, yet without a source. It whispered a single word I couldn't fully make out, something ancient and guttural that left a raw ache in my chest. My skin prickled, every nerve alert as a suffocating wave of dread washed over me. Panic surged. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen refused to light, dead in my trembling hands. The door's lock rattled again, this time louder, more insistent. I backed away slowly, senses screaming for escape. The murmurs multiplied, swirling around me like a gathering storm. Turning on my heel, I fled down the corridors, shadows seeming to reach out and brush against my coat. The sound of footsteps, too many to count, pursued me, echoing faster and faster. The ancient stone walls felt like they were closing in, narrowing the path to safety. I burst into the main hall, gasping for breath, heart racing wildly. The oppressive presence lifted slightly, but a cold residue of fear clung to me. The locked door remained shut, silent once more, as if nothing had happened. Yet I knew better. Something had stirred. Something had noticed me. That night I lay awake, the echoes of whispers and footsteps ringing in my ears. I was no longer a mere observer in the archives. I had crossed an invisible line, awakening a force that was watching, waiting, and far older than I could have imagined. After that night, everything changed. I returned to my quarters drenched in cold sweat, my heart still pounding like a drumbeat against my ribs. The rational part of me kept insisting it was fatigue or stress playing tricks on my mind, but deep down, I knew something else had happened, something I couldn't ignore or explain away. The locked door, the whispered voice, the subtle shift in the lock's position, these were not figments of imagination. They were warnings, or perhaps invitations, from something ancient and patient. Lying awake, the shadows in my room seemed to move with a life of their own. The darkness pressed close, suffocating, and I found myself trembling uncontrollably. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, to focus on mundane things, the notes I had taken, the manuscripts I had studied. But the night's events loomed large, a dark weight pressing on my chest. Every creak and sigh of the building became amplified, echoing like sinister footsteps in the silence. My dreams that night offered no refuge. They were fractured and haunting, filled with images of twisted figures cloaked in shadow, cryptic symbols glowing faintly in candlelight, and ancient rituals performed beneath vaulted ceilings I had only read about in forbidden texts. The line between sleep and wakefulness blurred until I was left questioning the reality of both. Woke gasping, drenched in sweat, feeling the cold touch of unseen hands lingering on my skin. Emotionally, I was torn. Fear wrestled with curiosity. Despair clashed with a desperate need to uncover the truth. I knew the archives were more than a place of scholarship. They were a threshold to something darker and far older than history books revealed. This realization unsettled me profoundly. Was I risking my sanity for knowledge? Was I opening a door that should have remained locked forever? Yet despite the dread, I couldn't walk away. The pull of the archives, the mysteries hidden behind that door had me ensnared. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those whispers, soft, insistent, urging me deeper. The slow erosion of my peace was unmistakable. I felt myself slipping, a prisoner of obsession and fear. I also began to notice subtle changes in myself. Paranoia crept in like a silent fog. I flinched at shadows, jumped at sudden sounds, and found it harder to concentrate during the day. I caught myself scanning empty hallways, half expecting to see the figures from my dreams lurking just beyond my sight. Sleep became a battleground between exhaustion and terror. The isolation was crushing. The other researchers, bound by secrecy or fear, offered no solace. They shared polite smiles and vague reassurances, but avoided discussing the shadows lurking in the archives. I was left alone with my fears, my questions, and the slowly unfolding horror of what I might have unleashed. That night, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, I made a grim decision. I would continue my research, but with caution. I had to know what lay behind that door, what the manuscripts truly contained, and why the Holy See guarded these secrets so fiercely. Whatever the cost, I was drawn to the truth, bound to it by curiosity, dread, and something far older than me. The days following that harrowing night were marked by an unsettling mix of dread and determination. I felt as if I was walking a tightrope stretched taut between reason and madness. The archives, those vast, shadowed halls filled with secrets, called to me relentlessly. I knew I couldn't ignore the locked door any longer, nor the warnings etched faintly in the margins of the manuscripts I studied. The Forbidden Wing was no longer just a rumor whispered in the corridors. It was a looming presence, a silent guardian of truths, too dark for the light. Returning to my research with cautious resolve, I focused on the few manuscripts I could access that referenced arcane rituals and obscure rites. These texts were unlike anything I had studied before, fragile parchments inscribed in a blend of Latin and strange, unfamiliar symbols that seemed to shift and writhe on the page. Some illustrations depicted figures cloaked in shadow, performing ceremonies that felt both ancient and profoundly unsettling. The language hinted at forces beyond human comprehension, evoking fear and reverence in equal measure. I spent hours cross-referencing these texts with other historical documents, piecing together fragments of stories about secret societies within the church. These groups were said to have existed in the shadows for centuries, tasked with guarding dangerous knowledge and containing entities that defied natural law. The manuscripts implied that these societies wielded a power both sacred and terrifying, a power that had shaped the course of history in unseen ways. Despite the scholarly distance I tried to maintain, the more I uncovered, the more the boundaries between academic pursuit and personal obsession blurred. The symbols haunted my waking hours, creeping into my dreams with a persistence that was impossible to ignore. At times, I caught myself tracing the cryptic shapes absent-mindedly on my desk, as if trying to decipher a hidden message meant only for me. Outside the archives, the world seemed to carry on indifferent to my growing unease. Rome was vibrant and alive, its streets filled with tourists, locals, and the hum of daily life. Yet within the Vatican's walls, time felt suspended, caught between centuries, between faith and fear. The silence of the archives was a living thing pressing against my skin, whispering secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. That evening, as storm clouds gathered once again over the city, I found myself standing before the locked door in the alcove. The iron lock gleamed faintly, cold and unyielding. I placed my hand on the wood, feeling a pulse beneath the surface, an almost imperceptible vibration that sent a shiver through me. It was as if the door was more than wood and metal. It was a barrier between worlds. In that moment, I understood that what lay beyond was not merely forbidden by rules or decrees. It was forbidden because it was dangerous. Yet the pull to uncover its secrets was stronger than ever. The archives had swallowed me whole, and I was no longer just a researcher. I was a seeker on the edge of revelation and ruin. That night, the archives revealed their darkest face yet. The air inside had grown heavier, oppressive in a way I had never experienced before. I returned after hours, drawn by the whisper of something that felt like both invitation and warning. The flickering candlelight cast monstrous shapes against the ancient stone walls, and the silence was punctuated only by the slow, deliberate rustling of pages somewhere deep within the Forbidden Wing. As I approached the locked door, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The whispers I had heard before returned, louder now, layered with voices speaking in tongues I could not recognize, some ancient dialects, others utterly alien. The words were unintelligible but carried a terrible weight, as if they were spells or incantations meant to bind or awaken something unspeakable. My fingers trembled as I reached into my coat pocket, producing a small, worn key I had found tucked inside a forgotten manuscript days earlier. I had kept it hidden, unsure of its purpose, but tonight, something compelled me to try it on the lock. The key slid smoothly into the iron clasp, turning with a resonant click that echoed through the empty halls. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. A cold, fetid breath of air rolled out, carrying the scent of damp earth, decay, and something metallic, like blood long dried but never fully cleansed. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of voices swelling from the depths below. I hesitated, heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to flee back into the safety of the known archives above. But the weight of forbidden knowledge was too heavy, the thirst for truth too consuming. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The stairway spiraled downward, lit only by faint, flickering torches set in sconces carved from blackened stone. The walls were covered in grotesque carvings, figures contorted in agony, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when not directly looked at. The deeper I went, the louder the whispers grew, echoing off the stone like a chant meant to bind some ancient force. At the bottom, I entered a vast chamber, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows. In the center stood an altar, cracked and stained, surrounded by relics and parchments I could barely comprehend. The air was thick with a presence so malevolent it pressed against my skin, chilling my blood. I realized then that this was no ordinary archive. It was a sanctuary, a prison for something unholy. As I stepped closer, a shadow moved at the edge of my vision, vanishing before I could focus. The whispers crescendoed into a scream that pierced my mind, forcing me to clutch my head in agony. I staggered back, breath ragged, feeling as if the walls themselves were closing in. I fled up the stairs, the oppressive presence chasing me until I burst into the light of the main archives. The door slammed shut behind me with a final thunderous boom. Silence fell again, but the weight of what I had seen and felt lingered, an indelible mark on my soul. The moment I slammed the door behind me, a sharp wave of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The silence that followed was suffocating, a stark contrast to the oppressive noise from below. My heart pounded erratically, threatening to break free from my chest, while sweat slicked my palms despite the chill in the air. I leaned against the cold stone wall, struggling to catch my breath and make sense of what I had just witnessed, or more accurately, survived. Every detail of that hidden chamber clawed at my mind, refusing to fade. The carved figures writhing in eternal torment, the altar stained with ages of forgotten rites, and the malevolent presence that felt almost sentient. It was as if the air itself had a weight, thick with a history of suffering and dark pacts that defied comprehension. I knew this was no ordinary discovery. It was a threshold into something ancient and terrible, a place where faith and horror collided. Emotionally, I felt shattered and vulnerable. A part of me wanted to flee and never return, to erase the memories seared into my mind. Yet paradoxically, I was consumed by a desperate need to understand. What was imprisoned here? Why had the church gone to such lengths to conceal this? Was it evil, or merely knowledge too dangerous for humanity? The questions tormented me, each answer more elusive and disturbing than the last. My rational mind tried to push the fear aside, focusing instead on facts and scholarship. But fear has a way of seeping into the cracks of reason, twisting and distorting perception. Every creak of the ancient building, every whisper of the drafts. It now felt like a harbinger. Sleep was a stranger. Nightmares haunted my restless nights, blending the horrors of the chamber with my deepest insecurities and fears. Isolation weighed heavily. The few colleagues I trusted dismissed my growing obsession as stress or exhaustion. The secret I now carried was a burden I bore alone. The archives themselves felt like a trap, an endless maze of shadows and half-truths designed to ensnare those who dared seek forbidden knowledge. Yet beneath the fear and fatigue, something stubborn flickered, a will to continue. I was tethered to this place, to these secrets, by something stronger than fear or reason. It was curiosity, yes, but also a dawning sense of responsibility. If such darkness existed, buried beneath centuries of faith and history, then perhaps it was my duty to uncover it, to bear witness, to understand, even if it meant risking everything. That night, staring into the darkness of my quarters, I realized the line I had crossed was irreversible. The archives had become a part of me, a place where light and shadow intertwined, where faith met fear, and where the price of truth might be more than I could ever pay. The following morning, I returned to the archives with a heavy heart and a mind clouded by the horrors I'd uncovered the night before. The daylight did little to dispel the darkness that had taken root inside me. The grand halls of the Holy See still loomed as vast cathedrals of silence, but my steps felt heavier, burdened by the knowledge that beneath their sacred stones lay secrets best left undisturbed. I reminded myself of my role, an academic researcher, entrusted with preserving and studying history. Yet this history was no ordinary record of saints and scriptures. It was a chronicle tainted by fear, hidden sins, and perhaps even supernatural dread. The manuscripts I sifted through bore strange annotations, some in Latin, others in languages I could barely recognize. The ink was often smudged as if written in haste or under duress. Some pages seemed almost alive, their cryptic symbols twisting and shifting faintly when glanced at from the corner of my eye. Despite my growing obsession, I maintained a scholarly facade. I approached the archivists and priests with carefully worded questions, probing for more details on the restricted wing and the shadowy histories it concealed. Their responses were curt and evasive, their eyes flickering with unease. I sensed an unspoken warning. Some knowledge was guarded not only by locks, but by fear and faith alike. In my private moments, I pored over the fragile diary I'd found, its pages fragile, yellowed with age but stubbornly inscribed with a desperate urgency. The diary chronicled an archivist's gradual descent into madness, consumed by the very secrets he was sworn to protect. His final entries spoke of a veil between worlds thinning, of shadows growing restless, and of a presence watching from the darkness. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred for him, and I could feel his terror bleeding across the centuries. The weight of these discoveries pressed heavily on me. Each fragment pieced together a puzzle darker than any I had imagined, revealing a hidden battle between light and shadow fought in silence. The Church's official histories seemed like a carefully crafted mask, behind which lurked truths too terrible to share. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows, I found myself standing once again before the forbidden door. The iron lock gleamed ominously, cold and impenetrable. My fingers itched to turn the key I'd kept hidden, but fear held me back. The last encounter had shown me the cost of crossing this threshold. Still, the question remained. What was the true nature of the secret the Church guarded, and was I ready to face it? Outside, the sounds of Rome carried on, lively markets, church bells ringing, distant laughter. But within the archives, time felt suspended, caught between the sacred and the profane. I was caught in that liminal space, a researcher standing on the edge of revelation and ruin, knowing that the next step could change everything. That evening, the air in the archives was dense with a suffocating stillness unlike anything I had felt before. The usual faint hum of activity was replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the distant ticking of an ancient clock somewhere deep within the building. As twilight bled through the narrow windows, casting long shadows that twisted and danced, I felt a growing tension in the atmosphere, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Drawn once again to the forbidden door, I found myself standing before it in the dim light, the cold iron lock gleaming faintly like a dark eye watching me. My pulse quickened, each heartbeat a loud drum in my ears. I could no longer ignore the strange key I had hidden away. It seemed to beckon me, promising answers and danger in equal measure. With trembling hands, I slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, an ominous click reverberating through the stillness. The door groaned open, revealing the narrow stairway descending into pitch-black darkness. A blast of cold air rushed out, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp earth, decay, and something metallic, like ancient blood long dried but never cleansed. Step by cautious step, I descended into the depths. The flickering torchlight barely pierced the oppressive shadows, revealing walls carved with grotesque figures, twisted faces frozen in eternal torment, cryptic symbols that seemed to writhe and shift as I stared. The whispers began again, soft at first, then swelling into a chorus of unintelligible murmurs that pressed against my sanity. At the bottom, I entered a vast chamber with a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The room was dominated by a cracked altar stained with darkened splotches, surrounded by relics and parchments that radiated an aura of malevolence. The oppressive atmosphere was tangible. It pressed against my skin, seeping into my bones. It was a place of ancient rituals, unholy sacrifices, and secrets the Church had locked away for centuries. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The whispers turned to guttural chants, reverberating off the stone. A cold wave of fear crashed over me, paralyzing yet compelling. The room seemed alive, breathing, watching. My instincts screamed to flee, but my feet felt rooted. The air thickened, and the sense of being observed intensified, as if unseen eyes bore into my soul. Panic surged. My breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat trickled down my brow. Then, without warning, a sharp, bone-chilling scream shattered the silence, an otherworldly wail that echoed deep inside my mind. I clutched my head, staggering back toward the stairs. The chanting grew louder, the shadows lengthening, reaching. I fled upward, heart pounding, until the heavy door slammed shut behind me with a deafening finality. Breathless and shaking, I collapsed against the stone wall, the oppressive presence still lingering like a dark stain on my soul. The archives had revealed their true nature, a threshold to a darkness old, than time itself. I was no longer merely a researcher. I was a trespasser in a realm where faith, fear, and the supernatural intertwined in a dreadful dance. The moment the heavy door slammed shut behind me, I was overcome by a wave of exhaustion unlike anything I had ever known. My legs gave way beneath me, and I sank to the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, heart hammering wildly against my ribs. The oppressive weight of that chamber, the dark altar, the malevolent presence, the shadows that seemed alive, clung to me like a suffocating shroud. Even though I was back in the relative safety of the main archives, a residue of that terror lingered, seeping into my skin, into my bones. I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing, struggling to piece together what I had witnessed. The grotesque carvings etched into the walls haunted my vision, faces twisted in silent screams, symbols that defied understanding. The whispers and chanting still echoed faintly in my ears, like the fading remnants of a nightmare that refused to release me. The cold, metallic scent of ancient blood seemed to linger in the air, and I could almost feel unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Emotionally, I was adrift in a storm of conflicting feelings. There was terror, raw and immediate, that threatened to consume me entirely, but beneath that was a stubborn, gnawing curiosity, a desperate need to understand what I had stumbled upon. Was this the true nature of the Church's hidden history, a place where faith and darkness entwined in an unholy pact? The knowledge I had uncovered was not just academic, it was a glimpse into a reality so horrific it challenged everything I believed. Sleep offered no refuge. That night my dreams were invaded by shadowy figures and cryptic symbols, by the relentless chanting that seemed to echo from the depths of that underground chamber. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, leaving me disoriented and raw. I woke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me back from those depths. Isolation deepened. I found it impossible to share my experience without sounding mad. The other researchers, bound by silence or fear, offered only polite detachment. The secret I now carried was a heavy burden I bore alone. The archives had transformed from a sanctuary of knowledge to a labyrinth of dread and silence, a place where the past was a living, breathing threat. Yet even as fear clawed at me, I knew I could not turn away. The door I had opened was a threshold not easily closed. Whatever darkness lay beneath the surface of the Holy See's archives was waiting, patient and eternal. I was caught in its web, a reluctant witness to truths that could unravel everything I thought I knew about faith, history, and the very nature of evil. That night, as dawn crept slowly over the city, I made a silent vow. I would continue. I would delve deeper, seek answers, and face the darkness head-on. The path ahead was uncertain and perilous, but I was bound to it now, by curiosity, by fear, and by the shadows that had claimed a piece of my soul. The morning light spilled weakly through the tall windows of the archives, casting long, dusty beams onto the marble floors. The usual quiet hum of the Vatican was present, but for me, the world felt changed, heavier, more fragile. The memories of that forbidden chamber haunted every step I took, every page I turned in the manuscripts. I was caught in a strange limbo, suspended between the visible world of history and the unseen shadows lurking beneath the surface. My routine as a researcher continued, but it was different now. Each document I examined, each note I took, was filtered through a lens clouded with suspicion and fear. I found myself double-checking every reference to secret societies, arcane rituals, and hidden texts. The more I uncovered, the more I sensed the outlines of a vast hidden narrative, a web of silence, PR, protection, and dark devotion woven through centuries of church history. Outside the library doors, the sounds of Rome carried on as usual, the distant chatter of market vendors, the clatter of footsteps on cobblestones, church bells ringing solemnly. But inside, time seemed to slow. The archives were a place out of time, where whispers of the past mingled with the cold stone walls and fading frescoes. I felt isolated, a solitary figure lost in a maze of secrets few dared to acknowledge. I spent hours poring over a collection of medieval parchments that hinted at a mysterious order sworn to guard the veil, a boundary between this world and the realm of shadows. The texts were fragmented and obscure, written in a mixture of Latin and cryptic runes. Some pages bore scorch marks, as if touched by fire, and others smelled faintly of incense and decay. The description spoke of rituals meant to keep dark forces imprisoned, but also warned of the terrible cost of failure. My colleagues were noticeably more guarded around me. When I asked about these obscure references, their answers were evasive, sometimes laced with quiet fear. One senior archivist muttered, "Knowledge is a burden. Some truths can destroy more than they reveal." I sensed unspoken warnings, a shared understanding that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. That evening the sky outside darkened with a gathering storm. The cold draft whispered through the corridors, carrying with it a faint, unsettling scent, a mix of damp stone, old parchment, and something metallic, like blood. I found myself once again drawn to the forbidden alcove, standing before the locked door that had become a symbol of all I feared and desired to know. Placing my hand on the cold wood, I felt a pulse beneath the surface, not just the chill of stone, but something alive, ancient and watchful. The shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the light. I realized then that the archives were no longer just a place of study. They were a crossroads, a liminal space where past and present, faith and fear, reality and nightmare converged. And I was standing at the threshold, unsure whether to step forward or turn back before it was too late. That night, the storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside me. Thunder rumbled low and the wind howled through the ancient stone corridors of the archives. The flickering light from the antique sconces cast eerie shadows, which seemed to dance and stretch with unnatural life. The building itself felt restless, like a beast awakening from a long slumber, waiting for something, waiting for me. Drawn once more to the forbidden door, I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, an urgent drumbeat of dread and anticipation. The small key I had kept hidden trembled in my pocket, as if it knew it was about to unleash horrors best left buried. The air was thick and cold, every breath a sharp stab against my lungs. I reached out, fingers brushing the iron lock, and slid the key in. The lock turned with a sonorous click that echoed through the silence. As the door creaked open, a rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the heavy scent of damp earth, decay, and something metallic, like blood long dried but never fully cleansed. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, swallowing the feeble light. I descended the narrow stairway, each step echoing in the confined space. The walls were adorned with carvings more grotesque than before, twisted faces contorted in silent agony, symbols that writhed and shifted when not looked at directly. Whispers filled the air, a chorus of voices speaking in tongues known to me. The sounds pressed against my sanity, both terrifying and hypnotic. At the bottom, I stepped into the vast chamber. The vaulted ceiling vanished into shadows, and the air was thick with malevolence. In the center stood a cracked altar, stained dark with the passage of uncounted years. Surrounding it were relics and parchments radiating an aura of ancient evil. Suddenly, movement flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow too quick to focus on. The whispers rose to a cacophony, chanting in a guttural rhythm that sent chills down my spine. The oppressive presence grew heavier, pressing against me like a physical force. My rational mind screamed to flee, but my feet felt rooted. The room seemed alive, breathing, watching. Then came the scream, an otherworldly wail that pierced through the chamber and into my mind. Pain exploded behind my eyes, and I clutched my head, staggering backward. Fear overtook me. I turned and fled up the stairs, the shadows reaching out to grab me. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening boom, sealing the darkness once more. Gasping for breath, I pressed my back to the wall, trembling and broken, forever changed by what I had seen. The door slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the very stone beneath me, and I was suddenly consumed by a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. I sank to the cold floor of the archives, my breath ragged and uneven, chest heaving as if I had run a marathon rather than a few frantic steps upstairs. The darkness in that chamber had chased me out, but the shadow it left behind clung to my skin, my clothes, and worst of all, my mind. Every detail of what I had witnessed replayed relentlessly in my thoughts. The grotesque carvings etched into the walls, the ancient altar cracked and stained with time and sin, the whispered chants that seemed to seep into my very soul. The feeling of unseen eyes watching me, waiting, lingered like a cold chill that refused to fade. The scent of decay and blood still seemed to hover in the air around me, despite the daylight flooding the main archives. Emotionally, I was shattered. The terror was raw and immediate. gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Yet beneath that fear was a relentless curiosity that twisted and churned in my gut. What had I unleashed? What ancient evil was bound beneath those stones, hidden from the world by layers of faith and silence? These questions haunted me like ghosts that refused to be exorcised. Sleep became a battlefield. Nightmares flooded my dreams, shadows reaching out with clawed hands, voices chanting in languages I did not understand, cryptic symbols glowing with an unholy light. I woke in cold sweats, heart racing, unable to distinguish where the nightmare ended and reality began. The line between the two blurred until I felt as if I was living in a waking horror, caught between worlds. Isolation deepened as I withdrew from colleagues and friends. Who could I tell? Who would believe the things I'd seen? The secrecy surrounding the archives was impenetrable. The few I trusted offered only vague sympathies, perhaps fearing the same darkness, perhaps afraid to acknowledge it openly. I was alone, carrying the burden of forbidden knowledge that threatened to consume me whole. Yet despite the fear, a stubborn part of me remained. I was no longer simply a researcher. I was a witness, a reluctant participant in a story far larger than myself. The truth lay buried beneath centuries of stone and scripture, waiting to be unearthed. And I was as bound by curiosity and dread alike to continue down this path. That day, as the first light of dawn seeped through the high windows, I made a silent vow. Whatever horrors awaited, whatever darkness I faced, I would not turn away. The archives had claimed a part of my soul, and I was theirs now, tethered to secrets that might destroy me, or perhaps define me. The morning sun cast a pale light through the high stained-glass windows of the Vatican archives, illuminating motes of dust that floated silently in the air. Outside, Rome was waking with the usual bustle, the distant clatter of footsteps on cobblestones, church bells ringing softly in the early hour, and the murmur of voices in markets and streets. Yet inside the archives a heavy silence hung, as if the building itself was holding its breath. For me, this place had transformed from a sanctuary of learning to a labyrinth of shadows, its every corner steeped in secrets I could barely comprehend. The memories of the underground chamber, the altar, the twisted carvings, the whispered chants were etched deeply into my mind. Each day since that night I wrestled with the weight of what I had seen, struggling to maintain the thin veneer of normalcy expected of a researcher at the Holy See. But beneath the surface, a storm raged, fear, curiosity, and a growing sense of unease that I could neither silence nor escape. My research had taken on a new urgency. I spent hours poring over fragile parchments and ancient manuscripts, searching for clues about the shadowy order hinted at in the texts. A secretive group sworn to guard the veil, the boundary between this world and something far darker. The writings were fragmented and cryptic, mixing Latin with symbols that twisted and shifted on the page. Some of the documents were scorched at the edges, their ink faded or smeared as if touched by fire or blood. The more I uncased, the more I realized how carefully the Church had concealed these truths, burying them beneath layers of doctrine and silence. Colleagues were increasingly wary around me. When I mentioned the forbidden wing or the mysterious order, their eyes would flicker with apprehension, and conversations would abruptly end. A senior archivist once warned me quietly, "Some knowledge comes at a price. The Church protects not just for secrecy, but to shield the world from things it cannot understand." The weight of that unspoken caution hung heavily between us, a silent reminder of the peril I was courting. Even the archives themselves seemed to respond to my obsession. The air grew colder, drafts whispered through unseen cracks, and shadows deepened in corners where light should have reached. Sometimes I caught fleeting glimpses of movement in the periphery of my vision, a flicker of shadow, a whisper carried on the stale air, that vanished whenever I looked directly. That evening, as thunder rumbled over the city and rain began to patter against the ancient stone, I found myself once again at the threshold of the forbidden door. The iron lock gleamed dully in the dim light, cold and unyielding. My hand hovered, fingers trembling, torn between fear and the insatiable need to know what lay beyond. The archives had become more than a place of study. They were a crossing point between light and darkness, past and present, faith and nightmare, and I was standing on the edge of revelation and ruin, unsure if I was ready to step through. That night, the atmosphere inside the archives was charged with a heavy tension I hadn't felt before. The usual stillness had morphed into something darker, thick, palpable, as if the very air was charged with unseen electricity. Flickering candlelight cast wavering shadows across the ancient stone walls, shadows that seemed to stretch and twist beyond their natural limits. Every sound, my footsteps, the rustling of parchment, even my own breath, felt amplified in the suffocating silence. Compelled by a force I could neither resist nor fully understand, I approached the forbidden door once more. The small key rested heavily in my palm, cold and smooth, as if it held the weight of the centuries it had lain hidden. My fingers trembled as I slid it into the iron lock, turning slowly. The mechanism yielded with a chilling click that echoed down the empty corridors like a death knell. The door swung open with a slow, mournful creak, revealing the narrow stairway descending into blackness. A blast of frigid air escaped, carrying a pungent mixture of damp earth, ancient incense, and something far fouler. An acrid metallic scent that clung to my senses like blood long dried but never cleansed. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside, each footfall a heavy echo on the stone steps. The walls of the stairwell were covered with grotesque carvings, twisted faces contorted in silent screams, runes and sigils that seemed to writhe and shimmer in the flickering torchlight. The deeper I descended, the louder the whispers grew, swelling from a barely audible murmur to a dissonant chorus of voices chanting in languages I couldn't recognize. The sound pressed against my mind, fraying the edges of reason and sanity. At the bottom, I entered the vast chamber again, the vaulted ceiling lost in darkness above me. The cracked altar stood ominously in the center, stained with the dark remnants of long-forgotten rituals. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying an undeniable sense of malevolence. Relics and parchments lay scattered, their presence radiating an aura that twisted and bent the shadows around them. Suddenly, movement flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow slipping between pillars, vanishing when I turned to look. The chanting rose into a guttural crescendo, vibrating in my chest and filling my head with unbearable pressure. The chamber seemed alive, breathing, watching. My rational mind screamed at me to flee, but my legs felt rooted. The walls appeared to close in, the shadows reaching out with intangible fingers. Then came the scream, a piercing, otherworldly wail that tore through the chamber and into my very soul. Agony exploded behind my eyes. I clutched my head, staggering backward, overwhelmed by terror. Panic surged, breaking the paralysis. I turned and fled up the stairs, shadows clawing at my heels. The door slammed shut behind me with a thunderous finality, sealing the darkness away once more. I collapsed against the cold stone, breathless and broken, forever marked by what I had seen and heard in that unholy place. The sound of the heavy door slamming shut echoed in my ears long after I had fallen to the cold stone floor, gasping for air. My chest heaved uncontrollably, and the tremors in my limbs refused to subside. I felt raw, as if some part of me had been peeled away and exposed to the bitter cold of that chamber's darkness. The air outside, though filled with the usual musty scent of aged parchment and stone, no longer felt safe. Something unseen clung to me, a residue of the malevolent presence I had fled. My mind replayed every horrifying detail over and over, the grotesque carvings that seemed to twist when unobserved, the ancient altar stained with unholy remnants, the chanting voices that felt like claws scratching at my sanity, the metallic smell of old blood, the oppressive atmosphere, and the fleeting shadow that moved just beyond sight. It all combined into a living nightmare I couldn't shake. Even now, I could almost hear the distant wails echoing in my head, an otherworldly scream that shattered any attempt at calm. Emotionally, I was adrift in a storm of fear, confusion, and an unsettling obsession. The terror was immediate and suffocating, but beneath it, a relentless curiosity gnawed at me. What exactly was imprisoned down there? Why had it been hidden for centuries beneath the veneer of sanctity? The weight of forbidden knowledge was crushing. I felt simultaneously cursed and chosen, burdened with secrets that threatened to unravel my understanding of reality itself. Sleep, when it came, was no refuge. My nights were invaded by vivid nightmares, shadows writhing in the corners of my vision, whispers curling around me like smoke. I awoke often, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, trapped in the liminal space between nightmare and waking life. The line blurred until fear became my constant companion, a shadow that lurked even in daylight. Isolation deepened. Sharing these experiences was impossible. The fear of disbelief, ridicule, or worse kept me silent. Colleagues grew distant, conversations dwindled to polite exchanges, and I found myself increasingly alone in this dark journey. The archives, once a place of academic pursuit, had transformed into a maze of dread and secrecy, an eternal prison for those who dared seek the truth beneath the surface. Yet, amidst the despair and exhaustion, a stubborn resolve remained. I was no longer merely a researcher. I had become a witness and a reluctant guardian of secrets that threatened to consume me. The door I had opened was not just a physical threshold, but a passage into a darkness that defied understanding, a darkness that was now part of me. As dawn crept slowly over Rome, painting the ancient stones with fragile light, I made a silent vow to continue, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost, to face the shadows waiting beyond knowledge and faith. The path ahead was uncertain and terrifying, but turning back was no longer an option. The archives had claimed me, and I was theirs now, caught forever between light and shadow. The early morning air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and distant sea salt from the Tiber River. Inside the vast halls of the Vatican archives, however, a heavy stillness persisted, as though the building itself held its breath. The sun's first rays filtered weakly through the stained glass, casting fractured pools of color across ancient stone floors, yet no warmth reached the corners where shadows clung stubbornly. For me, the archives had become a liminal space, a place caught between time and terror, faith and fear. I settled at my usual workspace, a worn oak table littered with scrolls and fragile manuscripts, some so delicate their edges crumbled at a mere touch. The weight of the previous night's horrors pressed down on me like an invisible hand, my thoughts tangled with visions of that underground chamber, the altar cracked and stained with centuries-old secrets, the cryptic carvings that writhed in shadow, the voices whispering in tongues I could not comprehend. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself of the rationality and purpose that had brought me here. I was, after all, a scholar, a seeker of knowledge, charged with unearthing truths buried by time and silence. But the line between discovery and dread had blurred. The texts I studied now bore sinister undertones, coded warnings, obscure references to an ancient veil protecting this world from something beyond, and the secretive order sworn to guard it. Each page seemed to pulse with a hidden life, the ink shifting as if alive, challenging my understanding of reality. Some manuscripts appeared charred, their edges singed as if they had survived flames meant to destroy forbidden knowledge. Other documents emitted faint traces of incense and something metallic, an unsettling reminder of rituals steeped in blood and shadow. Colleagues were visibly uneasy when I broached these subjects, their eyes darting away, words clipped and evasive. One whispered, "Some doors once opened can never be closed." Their silence was a warning, a shield against truths too perilous to confront. Yet the hunger to understand only deepened, an insatiable pull driving me closer to the edge. As dusk settled outside, thunder rumbled faintly on the horizon, a storm brewing over the city. The chill in the archives thickened, and drafts whispered through unseen cracks, carrying with them scents of damp stone, ancient parchment, and that ever-present metallic tang. Standing before the locked door to the forbidden wing, I felt the weight of centuries bearing down, a threshold between knowledge and oblivion. My fingers brushed the cold iron handle, hesitation twisting in my gut. The archives were no longer a place of mere scholarship. They had become a battleground of faith and fear, light and shadow. And I was poised on the brink, the choice to step forward or retreat heavy with consequence. The night was heavy with anticipation as I approached the forbidden door once again. Outside, thunder rumbled low and steady, punctuating the oppressive silence of the archives. Flickering torchlight cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the ancient stone walls, like living things watching my every move. My breath came shallow and quick, each exhale a visible mist in the cold air that seeped through cracks in the centuries-old masonry. I felt the weight of the key in my palm, smooth, cold, and impossibly heavy with the gravity of what it could unleash. My hand trembled as I slid it into the lock, turning it slowly. The click was loud in the stillness, reverberating down the hall like a final, dreadful bell. The door creaked open, revealing the narrow staircase that plunged into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the faint torchlight whole. I descended slowly, each step echoing in the confined space, the air growing colder and heavier with every meter. The walls around me were alive with grotesque carvings, faces twisted in eternal agony, serpentine symbols that shifted and pulsed when viewed from the corner of my eye. The faintest whisper began, growing quickly into a chorus of unintelligible murmurs that filled the chamber, pressing against my ears and twisting inside my mind. At the bottom, the vast chamber opened before me like a maw. The cracked altar, stained and worn, sat at the center, surrounded by relics that radiated a palpable darkness. The air was thick, almost viscous, choking and charged with malevolence. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, too swift to focus on, yet undeniably there. The whispers escalated into guttural chanting, vibrating through my body, stirring something ancient and dreadful. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted. The shadow seemed to reach for me, tendrils of darkness brushing against my skin. Then, a scream shattered the air. A piercing, unearthly wail that tore through my mind like jagged glass. Pain exploded behind my eyes, and I clutched my head, staggering backward, overwhelmed by terror and confusion. With every ounce of strength, I fled up the stairs, the darkness clawing at my heels. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed like a death knell. Collapsing against the stone wall, breathless and shaking, I was left with a terrifying certainty. The archives hid something alive, something ancient, something hungry, and I had just glimpsed the edge of its world. The heavy slam of the door behind me left an echo in the silent corridors of the archives, but the noise inside my head was far louder. I collapsed against the cold stone wall, sweat slicking my skin despite the chill that hung in the air. My breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps as I struggled to steady the storm raging within me. The weight of what I had witnessed pressed down like a physical force, suffocating, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Every detail replayed vividly. The grotesque carvings that seemed to pulse in the flickering torchlight, the cracked altar stained with ancient and sinister remnants, the chorus of chanting voices speaking in tongues beyond comprehension. Most terrifying was the shadow, an almost living presence that lurked just beyond sight, watching, waiting. The metallic scent of blood and decay seemed to cling to me, a reminder that I had ventured beyond the threshold of mortal knowledge. Emotionally, I was adrift in a sea of conflicting sensations. Raw fear clawed at the edges of my sanity, threatening to consume me entirely. Yet beneath that terror was a stubborn, gnawing curiosity. What exactly was imprisoned beneath the Holy See's stone floors? Why had the church hidden it away so carefully? The weight of these questions was crushing, and they pressed me toward a dark obsession I could neither deny nor escape. Night brought no relief. Sleep became a battleground where nightmares unfolded in vivid, terrifying detail. Shadows twisted and writhed in the corners of my vision. Disembodied voices whispered secrets I couldn't understand. I woke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, trapped between dream and reality. The boundary between the two grew thin, and I felt as if the darkness had followed me back from the depths, a constant companion in the waking world. Isolation deepened. Sharing these horrors seemed impossible. The fear of disbelief or dismissal kept me silent. My colleagues, once friendly and curious, now treated me with wary distance, their eyes filled with unspoken caution. The archives, once a place of sacred knowledge and learning, had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and silence, a prison for those who dared seek the truth. Yet amid the despair and exhaustion, a flicker of determination remained. I was no longer just a researcher. I was a witness to something ancient and terrible, caught in a web of secrets that threatened to unravel everything I knew. The door I had opened was not merely physical. It was a passage into a darkness that defied understanding, a darkness now a part of me. As dawn's pale light began to creep over Rome's rooftops, I made a silent vow. No matter the cost, I would continue. I would uncover the truth buried beneath centuries of faith and silence. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but turning back was no longer an option. The archives had claimed me, and I was theirs now, forever bound between light and shadow. The morning light filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the Vatican archives with a muted glow, as if even the sun hesitated to fully penetrate the ancient walls. Outside, the city of Rome stirred to life. Church bells chimed softly, and the distant hum of footsteps echoed through the cobblestone streets. But inside, the archives held a stillness that felt thick with history and secrets, as if time itself was trapped within the endless rows of parchment and leather-bound tomes. I sat at my usual desk, surrounded by fragile manuscripts whose edges curled with age. The weight of the past pressed down on me, heavier now than ever before. The memories of descending into the forbidden chamber haunted my every thought. The altar cracked and stained, the shadowy figures carved into the stone, the whispering voices that seemed to claw at my sanity. These images lingered like a shadow over my work, blurring the line between scholarly pursuit and obsession. My research had deepened into a labyrinth of cryptic texts and fragmented histories. I pored over manuscripts that hinted at the existence of a secret order, one entrusted with guarding the veil, the barrier separating our world from something far older and darker. The writings were fragmented, filled with obscure languages and symbols that danced just beyond comprehension. Some texts were scorched at the edges, as though someone had tried to erase their contents with fire, while others carried the faint scent of incense mixed with something metallic, sharp, and unsettling. Colleagues continued to avoid direct conversation about the Forbidden Wing. Their wary glances and clipped responses told me more than their words ever could. One archivist, with eyes clouded by age and experience, murmured quietly, "There are things best left buried. Some knowledge carries a price no man should pay." His words hung heavily in the air, a silent warning I could not ignore. As the day wore on, the temperature in the archives seemed to drop. Cold drafts whispered through cracks unseen, carrying with them faint scents of damp stone, old parchment, and that lingering metallic tang, the scent that had become synonymous with the darkness beneath. Shadows lengthened, twisting and flickering with the fading light. I found myself drawn once again to the door that had become both a symbol of forbidden knowledge and a barrier I feared to cross. Standing before the iron-bound portal, I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me. My fingers traced the cold metal handle, hesitation and determination warring within me. The archives were no longer merely a place of study, they were a threshold between the known and the unknowable. The choice to step forward or turn back carried consequences that I was only beginning to understand. The moment I turned the key in the lock, a shiver of dread crawled up my spine like cold fingers tracing my skin. The lock yielded with a reluctant click, a sound that echoed far louder in the stillness than it had any right to. The heavy door groaned open, revealing the familiar black maw of the narrow staircase descending into the subterranean chamber. A blast of cold, fetid air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp stone, ancient incense, and something more sinister, a metallic tang that lingered like dried blood. Each step I took downward was heavy with hesitation, yet propelled by a need I barely understood. The walls closed in, covered in the same grotesque carvings I had seen before, faces frozen in eternal agony, serpentine symbols that seemed to ripple and writhe when I wasn't looking directly. The air vibrated with an eerie chorus of whispers, a symphony of unintelligible tongues that pressed against my mind with growing urgency and malice. When I reached the chamber's vast expanse, the oppressive atmosphere nearly crushed me. The cracked altar sat at the center, bearing stains that looked dark enough to be dried blood. Around it lay ancient relics and parchment scrolls, radiating a malevolent energy I could feel pressing into my bones. The shadows pooled deep, shifting and breathing, as if the darkness itself was alive. Suddenly, movement flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow slipping between the carved pillars, vanishing when I turned to look. The whispers surged into guttural chanting, shaking the chamber with a low, rhythmic pulse. I felt frozen in place, the room tightening around me as though to trap me forever in its grasp. Then came the scream, a raw, piercing wail that tore through the air and into my very soul. It was a sound no human throat could produce, filled with agony and rage. I doubled over, clutching my head as a violent pressure exploded behind my eyes. Panic surged, breaking my paralysis, and I bolted for the stairs, the unseen darkness clawing desperately at my back. The heavy door slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a death knell, sealing away whatever had been unleashed. I collapsed outside, breathless, shaking, the metallic scent still clinging to my skin. I knew then that the archives were far more than a repository of knowledge. They were a gateway to something ancient and terrible, a place where faith and horror intertwined in a dark, unholy dance. The slam of the heavy door echoed through the cold stone corridors, but the noise inside my mind was deafening. I sank to the floor, trembling and gasping, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The darkness I had fled was no longer confined to that subterranean chamber. It had seeped into my very being, clinging to me like a second skin. The metallic scent of blood and decay lingered stubbornly in the air and on my clothes, a haunting reminder of what I had witnessed. Every detail replayed in vivid, merciless clarity. The grotesque faces carved into the walls, frozen in eternal torment. The cracked altar, stained with shadows of forgotten horrors. The whispering voices rising into a guttural chant that seemed to claw at my sanity. The shadow that had danced just beyond my sight. Alive, watching, and waiting. These images were no longer distant memories, they were etched into my soul. Emotionally, I was adrift in a tempest of fear, confusion, and a relentless, gnawing curiosity. The terror was raw and suffocating, threatening to consume me whole. Yet beneath that primal fear, a stubborn part of me longed to understand, to grasp the nature of the darkness I had glimpsed. What ancient evil lay imprisoned beneath the church's sacred halls? Why had it been hidden so carefully? The questions were a burden and a beacon, driving me deeper into obsession. Sleep became a battleground where nightmares ruled. Shadows writhed in the corners of my vision, and disembodied voices whispered secrets I could not decipher. I awoke often, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, caught between dream and waking. The boundary between reality and nightmare blurred until fear was a constant companion. Isolation deepened. The secret I carried was one I could share with no one. Colleagues became distant, Conversations clipped and wary. The archives, once a place of sacred knowledge, had transformed into a labyrinth of dread and silence, a prison for those who dared seek forbidden truths. Yet amid the despair, a flicker of determination endured. I was no longer just a researcher. I was a witness to something ancient and terrible, caught in a web of secrets that threatened to unravel everything I knew. The door I had opened was more than physical. It was a passage into darkness that defied understanding, a darkness now part of me. As dawn broke over Rome, casting fragile light upon the ancient stones, I made a silent vow. No matter the cost, I would continue. I would uncover the truth buried beneath centuries of faith and silence. The path ahead was uncertain and perilous, but turning back was impossible. The archives had claimed me, and I was theirs now, forever bound between light and shadow. The dawn was fragile, its pale light filtering hesitantly through the tall windows of the Vatican archives. Outside, the city stirred, the distant toll of church bells mingling with the murmurs of early risers and the occasional clatter of footsteps on the ancient cobblestones. Yet inside, the archives retained their solemn stillness, a cavern of silence where centuries of secrets lay entombed beneath layers of dust and stone. For me, this place had morphed into a crucible of dread and discovery, its heavy air thick with the weight of unseen truths. As I settled at my cluttered desk, surrounded by fragile manuscripts and brittle parchments, the memories of my recent descent into the forbidden chamber pressed against my mind like a relentless tide. The cracked altar, the grotesque carvings that twisted and writhed in the flickering torchlight, the chanting voices, these images haunted my thoughts, blurring the boundary between academic inquiry and obsession. The line between the seen and unseen seemed thinner here, as if the shadows themselves whispered warnings. My research had deepened into a labyrinth of obscure texts and cryptic symbols. The manuscripts spoke of an ancient order, bound by sacred oath to guard the veil, the fragile boundary that separated our world from a darker realm. The writings were fragmented, blending Latin with forgotten tongues and arcane sigils that seemed to shimmer with hidden meaning. Some pages bore scorch marks, their edges curled and blackened as if touched by unholy flames. Others carried phyta, not traces of incense mixed with a metallic scent that unsettled me deeply. Colleagues avoided discussing these matters openly, their eyes darting away when I mentioned the forbidden wing. A weathered archivist once confided in me, voice low and strained, "There are truths that devour the soul. Some knowledge is a burden too heavy for the living." His words echoed in my mind, a solemn caution that deepened the shadows around me. The temperature within the archives seemed to drop as dusk approached. Cold drafts whispered through unseen cracks, carrying with them scents of damp stone and old parchment. But always, that metallic tang lingered, like the lingering breath of something unseen and ancient. Shadows lengthened, flickering unnaturally in the fading light. I found myself drawn again to the forbidding door, its iron handle cold beneath my trembling fingers. This threshold was no longer merely a barrier of wood and metal, it was a boundary between worlds. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn away, but a deeper, more desperate need to know what lay beyond held me fast. The archives had become a place where faith and fear intertwined, where the light of reason fought against encroaching darkness, and I stood poised at the edge, on the cusp of revelation and ruin. The oppressive stillness of the archives was shattered only by the steady rhythm of my footsteps as I approached the forbidden door once again. The key rested cold and heavy in my hand, its weight a tangible reminder of the secrets it could unlock. My breath caught in my throat as I slid it into the lock, turning slowly, the metallic click reverberating through the silent hall like a somber toll. The door creaked open, revealing the narrow stairway that plunged into darkness so complete it swallowed the faint flicker of my torchlight. A cold, fetid breath escaped from below, carrying with it the stench of damp stone, ancient incense, and something far fouler, a metallic tang that clawed at my senses like old blood. Each step down was an exercise in restraint. The walls, adorned with grotesque carvings of twisted faces and serpentine symbols, seemed to close in around me. The shadows danced at the edge of my vision, shifting and writhing as if alive. A low murmur grew into a dissonant chorus, voices chanting in tongues I could not understand, pressing against my mind with an unbearable urgency. At the chamber's vast center stood the cracked altar, its surface stained with centuries-old remnants of rituals long forgotten. Surrounding it were relics and scrolls that radiated a palpable darkness. The air was thick and suffocating, charged with malevolence that seemed to seep into my bones. Suddenly, movement flickered in the periphery, a shadow slipping between the carved pillars. vanishing when I turned to look. The chanting escalated into guttural cries, vibrating through the chamber and into my very soul. The darkness seemed to reach out, tendrils of shadow brushing against my skin. Frozen in place, I felt the crushing weight of an ancient presence bearing down on me. Then an unearthly scream shattered the air, a raw, agonizing wail that pierced my mind and sent waves of searing pain behind my eyes. I clutched my head, staggering backward, overwhelmed by terror and confusion. Instinct took over. I fled up the stairs, the shadows clawing desperately at my heels. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed like a death knell. Collapsing against the cold stone, breathless and broken, I was left with a harrowing certainty. The archives concealed something alive, ancient and hungry, and I had just glimpsed the edge of its dark world. The slam of the heavy door reverberated through the still corridors, but the noise inside my head was far louder. I collapsed onto the cold stone floor, trembling uncontrollably, my breath ragged and uneven as I tried to process the horror I had just endured. The oppressive atmosphere of the chamber had followed me out, clinging to my skin like a second skin, thick with the metallic scent of blood and decay, a reminder of the darkness I had barely escaped. Every detail seared itself into my memory with brutal clarity. The grotesque carvings that seemed to writhe and pulse beneath the flickering torchlight, the cracked altar stained with ancient rituals, the eerie chanting that echoed from some unseen abyss. Most chilling was the shadow, an indistinct but undeniably malevolent presence that lurked just beyond my sight, watching and waiting. These images no longer felt like distant memories. They were etched into the very core of my being. Emotionally, I was adrift in a maelstrom of fear, confusion, and a relentless curiosity that both terrified and compelled me. The primal dread that gripped me was suffocating, threatening to unravel my sanity. Yet beneath the surface, a stubborn, insatiable need to understand gnawed at me. What ancient evil was imprisoned beneath the holy halls? Why had it been concealed so meticulously? These questions were both a curse and a beacon, driving me deeper into obsession. Sleep offered no sanctuary. Nightmares invaded relentlessly, shadows twisting in the corners of my vision, disembodied voices whispering secrets I could not comprehend. I awoke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, trapped in the liminal space between dream and waking. The boundary blurred until fear became a constant companion, a shadow that haunted even the brightest hours. Isolation tightened its grip. The secret I carried was one I dared share with no one. Colleagues became distant, their glances wary, their words clipped. The archives, once a sanctuary of knowledge, had transformed into a labyrinth of dread and silence, a prison for those who dared seek forbidden truths. Yet amid despair and exhaustion, a flicker of resolve endured. I was no longer merely a researcher. I had become a witness to something ancient and terrible, ensnared in a web of secrets that threatened to unravel my reality. The door I had opened was not just physical. It was a threshold into darkness that defied understanding, a darkness now intertwined with my very soul. As dawn's fragile light crept over Rome's rooftops, casting hesitant rays upon the ancient stones, I made a silent vow. No matter the cost, I would continue. I would uncover the truths buried beneath centuries of faith and silence. The path ahead was uncertain and perilous, but retreat was no longer an option. The archives had claimed me, and I was theirs now, forever bound between light and shadow. The morning light was muted, filtered through thick, dusty panes of stained glass that fragmented it into dull, kaleidoscopic shards. Outside, Rome's usual morning bustle felt distant, almost unreal compared to the oppressive silence within the Vatican archives. The air was cold and stale, heavy with centuries of forgotten prayers and secrets long buried. Sitting alone at my desk, surrounded by ancient tomes and brittle scrolls, I felt the crushing weight of what I had uncovered pressing down on me like a physical force. Every corner of the archives seemed to whisper reminders of that night. The descent into the forbidden chamber, the altar cracked and stained with dark remnants, the twisted carvings that seemed to writhe and change when I wasn't looking. The voices I had heard, chanting in tongues not meant for human ears, echoed in the back of my mind, blending with the faint metallic scene that had lingered in the air since then. It was as though the darkness beneath had seeped into the very stones around me. My work had become an obsession, a desperate search through fragmented manuscripts and arcane symbols that hinted at the existence of a shadowy order. This group, sworn to guard the veil, stood as the Church's secret shield against something far older and more terrible than Scripture dared reveal. The texts were cryptic, layered with coded language and signs that danced at the edge of comprehension. Many pages were scorched, their edges blackened as if by fire or blood, and some carried faint traces of incense mixed with that chilling metallic tang. Colleagues who once exchanged polite greetings now avoided me, their eyes reflecting unspoken fear and caution. I caught whispers in the halls, warnings to leave certain subjects alone. An elder archivist, his face lined with years of silent knowledge, once murmured, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The price of truth is higher than most can bear." His words lingered in the air like a curse. The atmosphere grew colder as dusk fell. Drafts whispered through unseen cracks, carrying with them scents of damp stone and decaying parchment. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, flickering against the fading light. I found myself once again standing before the iron-bound door that had become both a symbol of forbidden knowledge and a threshold to unspeakable horrors. My fingers traced the cold metal handle, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The archives were no longer just a place of study. They were a battleground between light and shadow, faith and doubt, and I stood at the precipice, ready to cross the line that could forever change everything I thought I knew. The moment I turned the key in the lock, a shiver ran through me, cold and electric. The heavy iron door protested with a long, drawn-out creak, splitting the silence like a knife. Behind it lay the familiar descent into darkness, yet this time it felt heavier, more foreboding. A stale, fetid breath of air rushed out as I opened the door wider, smelling of damp stone, ancient incense, and that lingering metallic tang that seemed to seep into my skin. I stepped onto the narrow stone stairs, my footsteps echoing softly but sounding unbearably loud in the claustrophobic shaft. The walls were once again covered in those grotesque carvings, faces frozen in silent screams, serpentine symbols twisting in the flickering torchlight. The deeper I descended, the stronger the murmurs became, swirling around me in incomprehensible languages, voices that seemed to scrape against the edges of my sanity. Reaching the bottom, the vast chamber stretched before me like a pit of shadows. The cracked altar stood in the center, its surface stained with dark, dried remnants of unspeakable rituals. Relics and parchments were scattered about, each one radiating a cold, malevolent energy. The oppressive air was thick, almost suffocating, pressing down on my chest like an invisible weight. Suddenly, a movement flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow slipping between the carved pillars, vanishing when I tried to focus on it. The murmurs swelled into guttural chanting, vibrating in my bones. I felt frozen, trapped in place as the darkness seemed to reach out with intangible fingers, brushing against my skin with cold, cruel intent. Then, piercing through the chamber's heavy atmosphere, came a scream, not human, but something ancient and raw. A wail filled with agony and rage that tore into my very soul. Pain exploded behind my eyes. I doubled over, clutching my head, overwhelmed by terror and confusion. Instincts surged, breaking the paralysis. I fled, heart pounding wildly, up the narrow stairs. The shadows seemed to claw at me, relentless and desperate. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed like a death knell, sealing away whatever had been unleashed. Collapsing against the cold stone wall, gasping for breath, I was left with one terrifying certainty. The archives hid something alive, something ancient, something hungry, and I had barely escaped its grasp. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed like a death knell, but inside my mind, the chaos was only just beginning. I collapsed against the cold stone wall, trembling uncontrollably, my breath ragged and shallow. The metallic scent, the unmistakable trace of something ancient and sinister, clung stubbornly to my clothes and skin, a cruel reminder that whatever I had encountered beneath the archives had not simply been an illusion. Every detail of the chamber clawed at my thoughts. The cracked altar, stained and worn, the grotesque carvings that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight, the whispered chants in tongues I couldn't understand, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Most terrifying was the shadow, an indistinct living presence that slipped just beyond my gaze, watching and waiting with cold intent. These memories were no longer distant recollections, but scars etched into the core of my being. Emotionally, I was adrift in a tempest of fear, confusion, and an insatiable, gnawing curiosity. The raw terror threatened to overwhelm me, yet beneath it lay a stubborn need to understand, to grasp the nature of the ancient evil concealed beneath the church's sacred halls. Why had it been hidden so carefully? What price had been paid to keep it imprisoned? These questions tormented me relentlessly, both a curse and a beacon leading me deeper into obsession. Sleep became a battleground where nightmares ruled. Shadows twisted and writhed at the corners of my vision. Disembodied voices whispered secrets I could not decipher. I awoke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, caught between the worlds of dream and waking. The boundary blurred until fear became a constant companion, haunting even the brightest hours of daylight. Isolation deepened. The secret I carried was one I dared share with no one. Colleagues grew distant, their eyes wary, their words clipped and cautious. The archives, once a sanctuary of knowledge, had become a labyrinth of dread and silence, a prison for those who sought forbidden truths. Yet amid despair and exhaustion, a flicker of determination endured. I was no longer merely a researcher. I had become a witness to something ancient and terrible, ensnared in a web of secrets threatening to unravel my reality. The door I had opened was not just physical, it was a threshold into a darkness beyond understanding, a darkness now intertwined with my very soul. As dawn's fragile light crept over Rome's rooftops, casting hesitant rays upon the ancient stones, I made a silent vow. No matter the cost, I would continue. I would uncover the truths buried beneath centuries of faith and silence. The path ahead was uncertain and perilous, but retreat was no longer an option. The archives had claimed me, and I was theirs now, forever bound between light and shadow. The early morning sun cast a fragile glow over the Vatican, but inside the archives the air remained thick and cold, heavy with secrets too old and dark to be touched by light. I sat at my desk, surrounded by crumbling manuscripts and dusty tomes, the weight of what I'd uncovered pressing down on me like an unbearable burden. The quiet hum of the city beyond these ancient walls was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence within. Here time seemed frozen. Every shadow whispered of things best left forgotten. The memory of the forbidden chamber haunted me still. The cracked altar, its surface stained with age-old secrets. The grotesque carvings that seemed to shift beneath my gaze. The chanting voices that filled the air with a dreadful urgency. The metallic scent that clung to the stone floor and my clothes was a bitter reminder that whatever I had glimpsed was real, and far from benign. I pored over manuscripts with a feverish intensity, texts filled with cryptic language and arcane symbols that hinted at a secret order bound to guard the veil, a barrier separating our world from a darker realm beyond comprehension. Many pages were singed, their edges blackened as if touched by fire or blood, some marked with faded stains and ancient insignias. The more I learned, the deeper the shadows seemed to grow around me. Colleagues avoided me now, their polite smiles replaced by wary glances and hushed conversations behind closed doors. One elder archivist, whose years bore silent knowledge and sorrow, warned me quietly. Some truths consume the seeker. Be wary of what you chase in the dark. His words echoed in my mind like a dire prophecy. The temperature in the archives dropped as twilight approached. Cold drafts whispered through unseen cracks, carrying scents of damp stone and decayed parchment. Shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering and twisting in the dim light. I found myself drawn once again to the forbidding iron door that had become both a symbol of forbidden knowledge and a threshold to the unknown. My fingers lingered on the cold metal handle, heart pounding with equal parts fear and resolve. The archives were no longer merely a place of scholarship. They had become a battleground of light and shadow, faith and fear, and I stood on the edge of a precipice, ready to cross into whatever lay beyond, no matter the cost. The cold metal of the key felt unforgiving in my hand as I approached the iron door once again. The air was thick with tension, heavier than before, as if the very walls held their breath in anticipation. Slowly I slid the key into the ancient lock, turning it with deliberate care. The click echoed loudly, reverberating through the silent corridors, each second stretching unbearably as the door creaked open, revealing the familiar descent into darkness. The narrow staircase before me seemed to absorb every flicker of torchlight, swallowing the glow as I stepped inside. The musty, fetid scent of damp stone, mingled with the acrid tang of old incense and something far more sinister, clung to the air. The deeper I descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The carved faces lining the walls, frozen in eternal torment, seemed to twist subtly as I passed, their silent screams almost audible in the stillness. Whispers rose around me, an unintelligible chorus of voices that pressed against my mind like a tightening noose. Their cadence was hypnotic yet disorienting, pulling me deeper into the abyss. The shadows flickered and shifted unnaturally, brushing against my skin like icy fingers, leaving a trail of unease in their wake. At the center of the chamber stood the cracked altar, a sinister relic stained with the residue of forgotten rites. Around it lay relics that radiated a palpable darkness, their surfaces warped and worn by time. The very air vibrated with malevolence, an invisible force pressing down on my chest, making each breath a labor Then, out of the darkness, a shadow moved, swift, fluid, and almost alive. It slipped between pillars etched with serpentine symbols, vanishing the moment I turned to focus on it. The chanting swelled, evolving into guttural cries that echoed within my very bones. I was frozen, ensnared in a moment where time and reality seemed to fracture. Suddenly, a scream tore through the chamber, a raw, agonizing wail unlike any human sound, filled with fury and despair. It shattered my senses, sending a searing pain behind my eyes. I stumbled backward, clutching my head as waves of terror crashed over me. Instinct surged forth. I fled, heart pounding wildly, the shadows clawing at my heels. The stairs loomed ahead, and I scrambled upward, desperate for escape. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing away the darkness once more. Collapsing against the cold stone wall, gasping and shaken, I knew with terrifying certainty this place was alive with an ancient hunger, and I had barely escaped its grasp. The heavy door slammed behind me, its echo reverberating through the cold, empty corridors of the Vatican archives. But the noise inside my mind was far louder, a relentless storm of fear and disbelief that refused to abate. I collapsed against the cold stone wall, shaking uncontrollably, my breath ragged and shallow as I struggled to steady myself. The metallic scent lingered stubbornly in the air and on my skin, a cruel reminder that what I had witnessed was no mere hallucination or nightmare. The images replayed vividly in my mind, the cracked altar bathed in shadow, the grotesque carvings that seemed to writhe and shift beneath the flickering torchlight, and the chanting voices, unintelligible, yet filled with an ancient malice that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Most terrifying was the shadow itself, a living darkness that slipped just beyond my sight, watching with cold, unyielding intent. These memories were no longer distant recollections but scars etched deep within my soul. Emotionally, I was adrift in a tempest of dread, confusion, and an insatiable curiosity that both terrified and compelled me. The primal fear that gripped me threatened to unravel my sanity, yet beneath it lay a stubborn need to understand what had been unleashed. What ancient evil had been imprisoned beneath the sacred halls? Why had it been hidden so meticulously? These questions tormented me relentlessly, both a curse and a beacon drawing me deeper into obsession. Sleep became a battleground where nightmares ruled, shadows twisted and writhed at the edges of my vision, disembodied voices whispered secrets I could not decipher, and I awoke often, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, caught between the worlds of dream and waking. The boundary blurred until fear became a constant companion, a shadow that haunted even the brightest hours of daylight. Isolation tightened its grip. The secret I carried was one I dared share with no one. Colleagues became distant, their eyes wary, their words clipped and cautious. The archives, once a sanctuary of knowledge and faith, had transformed into a labyrinth of dread and silence, a prison for those who sought forbidden truths. Yet amid despair and exhaustion, a flicker of resolve endured. I was no longer merely a researcher. I had become a witness to something ancient and terrible, ensnared in a web of secrets that threatened to unravel my reality. The door I had opened was not just physical. It was a threshold into a darkness beyond understanding, a darkness now intertwined with my very soul. As dawn's fragile light crept over Rome's rooftops, casting hesitant rays upon the ancient stones, I made a silent vow. No matter the cost, I would continue. I would uncover the truths buried beneath centuries of faith and silence. The path ahead was uncertain and perilous, but retreat was no longer an option. The archives had claimed me, and I was theirs now, forever bound between light and shadow.